"Choose me or your mother," Victoria said sharply across the kitchen table, her voice cutting through the warm morning air like a sudden gust. I froze mid-step, the coffee pot in my hand forgotten, the aroma of freshly brewed beans mingling with the tension. Daniel sat opposite her, his hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes downcast, caught between the woman he had promised to love and the mother who had raised him. I took a slow breath and let the silence stretch, the clock ticking loudly in the background, each second amplifying the weight of the ultimatum. The living room beyond was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the blinds highlighting the dust motes that danced lazily in the air, a peaceful contrast to the storm of emotions that had just erupted. I set the coffee pot down, my hand steady despite the sudden racing of my heart. I noticed a half-finished crossword on the kitchen counter, the pencil still poised as if its writer had vanished mid-thought, a small mundane detail grounding me amidst the shock. Daniel's eyes flicked up briefly, and I saw the conflict etched in his features, the internal tug-of-war he didn't yet have the words to articulate. Victoria leaned forward, her expression hardening, and I recognized that determination, that insistence from years of subtle manipulation. I didn't respond, not with words, not with any outward sign of hurt. Instead, I chose the stillness, the calm observation, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it would, a witness to the choices that were being made, rather than a participant caught in the drama. The sunlight shifted, shadows lengthening across the floor, and I could feel the familiar ache in my chest, the kind that comes not from sudden loss but from the slow realization that life can pivot on a single sharp decision. I allowed my mind to drift briefly to the past, to Daniel as a small boy, clinging to my hand as we walked to the park, the laughter echoing through autumn leaves, the warmth of a family that once felt unbreakable. Those memories were a comfort and a sting at the same time, a reminder of what had been and what now teetered on the edge of collapse. Victoria's voice rose again, softer this time but no less insistent, attempting to frame her demand as reasonable, logical, necessary even, yet beneath it, I sensed the familiar undertone of control. Daniel's gaze shifted from her to me, a fleeting hesitation, a crack in the resolve that was quickly masked by an uneasy nod. I felt the sharp pang of disappointment, a quiet, hollow kind that settles deep into your bones, but I did not let it surface in my expression. Instead, I poured a cup of coffee for myself, the steam curling upward, a visual exhale, a ritual that kept me grounded. I carried it to the small table by the window and set it down with deliberate care, each movement precise, unhurried. I watched as the morning unfolded beyond the glass, the neighborhood waking, children's laughter in the distance, the hum of cars starting for work, the world continuing unabated while my own universe had shifted on its axis. I reflected on the choices before me, not in anger, not in despair, but with a clarity that only comes from years of observing, enduring, and quietly understanding human behavior. The silence was punctuated by the clink of the spoon against the mug as I stirred, the tactile sensation a reminder that I was still here, still present, still capable of seeing clearly. I allowed the narrative of the day to settle, the shock of the ultimatum to be catalogued internally, the emotions acknowledged but contained. I would not raise my voice, I would not beg or plead. I would wait, watch, and learn. This was not a moment for dramatic outbursts but for observation, for comprehension, for understanding the dynamics that had quietly shaped my family. The aroma of the coffee, the soft morning light, the distant sounds of life continuing outside, all combined to create a canvas on which I could paint the contours of my next actions. I reminded myself that my power was not in confrontation but in patience, in the quiet accumulation of awareness, in the steady, deliberate processing of events as they unfolded. Each heartbeat, each measured breath reinforced the knowledge that I had witnessed the turning point, and that the world could now be seen with a sharper lens. I allowed the moment to stretch, observing the tension between Victoria and Daniel, seeing the subtle cues, the micro-expressions, the tiny shifts in posture and gaze, the telltale signs of allegiance and doubt. And as I sat there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, I felt a quiet resolve solidifying, a sense of agency re-emerging from the shock, a preparedness to act with the same calm precision that had carried me through decades of life's unpredictable challenges. I took another slow sip, the warmth spreading through me, and I knew that though the morning had begun with an ultimatum that threatened to unbalance everything I had known, it had also presented clarity, a first step in understanding, and a foundation upon which I would build the careful, deliberate response that this situation demanded. The house was quiet after the morning confrontation, the only sounds the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards under my own feet as I moved about. I went to the dining room and adjusted the table, arranging the silverware and placemats with care, the act itself soothing, methodical, a small anchor in a day that felt unsettled. The sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting striped patterns across the wooden floor, and I noticed how long the shadows seemed, stretching and bending in ways that made the room feel both familiar and foreign. I poured myself a glass of water and took a slow sip, the cool liquid steadying my nerves as I reflected on the morning, the choice Daniel had made, and the subtle tension that now permeated every corner of my home. I moved through the kitchen, checking on the small herb garden by the window, the leaves glistening with morning dew, the familiar smells grounding me in a world that continued beyond the family drama unfolding inside. Each task, though simple, became a way to process the unease, to maintain a semblance of normalcy while my mind traced back through the years, recalling holidays, birthdays, ordinary breakfasts, and quiet conversations that had once defined our family life. The silence was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It carried the weight of contemplation, a pause to observe without interruption, a space in which to measure, understand, and plan. I glanced at the stack of mail on the counter, the envelopes unassuming yet potential vessels of information, reminders of the correspondence that had continued even as relationships shifted. I did not open them immediately, allowing the suspense to build, the anticipation to sharpen my awareness of the patterns and behaviors that had emerged over time. Outside, a neighbor walked their dog, the rhythmic steps on the sidewalk, a metronome marking the passage of hours, the consistency of their routine contrasting with the irregularity within my own household. I took a seat by the window, the chair familiar, the cushion worn in the perfect spots, and allowed my eyes to wander across the lawn, the edges of the garden, the small bird bath that had become a gathering place for sparrows. Each detail reinforced the reality that life persisted, that the external world was constant, while the internal one required careful navigation. I thought about Daniel and Victoria, their interactions precise, deliberate, each word measured, each gesture containing layers of meaning that only careful observation could uncover. The tension was subtle, present in the way Victoria moved through the space, the way Daniel responded to her requests and commands, the small hesitations, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture that betrayed inner conflict. I recorded these observations mentally, cataloging them with meticulous attention, understanding that the smallest details could reveal the intentions and desires of both. The afternoon light shifted, warmer now, and I rose to adjust the curtains, the motion deliberate, a repetition of familiar routines that provided a sense of stability and control. I moved to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of well-worn volumes, books that had been companions through decades, each a repository of memory and reflection, grounding me in the continuity of my own life even as the family dynamic shifted around me. I poured another glass of water, listening to the faint tick of the wall clock, each second a reminder of the progression of time, of the moments that had passed and the choices yet to come. I opened a journal and made brief notes, not so much to record events as to clarify thoughts, to trace the outlines of my response and strategy, the steady accumulation of awareness and preparedness. The sky outside deepened in color, the light softening, and I felt a quiet determination settle in my chest, a recognition that my place in this household and the broader family narrative would be asserted through patience, observation, and careful action rather than confrontation or reaction. I moved through the living room, adjusting a cushion, straightening a photograph frame, small gestures that anchored me in my own agency. Each movement, though mundane, was imbued with intent, a silent assertion that I remained present, attentive, and unyielding in my observation of the unfolding story. The evening drew closer, the warmth of the setting sun filtering through the windows, and I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to center, to embrace the quiet strength that had carried me through life's challenges before, and would continue to do so now. I knew that the path forward required clarity, patience, and calm, and in this quiet period of reflection and observation, I felt the first stirrings of resolve taking shape, an understanding that the unfolding events would be met not with immediate reaction but with deliberate, measured response, the quiet accumulation of power and insight, as I prepared to navigate the complexities of my family with steady hands and a clear mind. The afternoon light filtered softly through the living room windows, casting a warm glow over the furniture and highlighting the familiar textures of the rugs and upholstery. I moved slowly, deliberately from room to room, noticing small details that had previously escaped my attention. The slight tilt of a picture frame, the dust gathering along the edges of the windowsill, the faint imprint of a cup on the side table. Each observation became a meditation, a way to occupy my mind while also quietly taking note of changes in the household since the confrontation earlier that morning. I found myself drawn to the small writing desk near the window, its surface neat but populated with letters, bills, and notes that hinted at the life unfolding around me in subtle ways. I began to sort through them carefully, examining dates and details, the rhythmic act of handling paper providing a soothing cadence that steadied my thoughts. In the quiet, I could hear the faint murmur of traffic outside and the occasional laughter of children from a neighboring yard, sounds that underscored the continuity of life while my own family dynamic had become unsettled. I poured a second cup of coffee and carried it to the small armchair by the window, sinking into its familiar comfort. I allowed my gaze to drift outside, tracing the movement of the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the sunlight glinting off leaves, and the distant horizon where rooftops met sky. This routine, ordinary and yet deeply grounding, allowed me to process the events with a clarity that words alone could not provide. My mind turned to Daniel and Victoria, replaying the subtle cues of body language, tone, and timing that revealed their priorities and intentions. I cataloged them silently, noting how Daniel had glanced toward me during the ultimatum, the slight hesitation in his response, and the micro-expressions that flickered across Victoria's face when she thought no one was watching. Each nuance was a piece of the larger puzzle, informing my understanding of how to navigate the days ahead. I revisited memories of family dinners, of laughter shared around the table, of small acts of kindness that had been routine yet profound, now contrasted starkly against the tension and careful calculation that had replaced them. The contrast sharpened my awareness, emphasizing the importance of patience and observation over impulsive reaction. I walked through the kitchen, noting the placement of utensils and the organization of the pantry, each familiar arrangement providing a sense of order amidst the uncertainty. I allowed my eyes to rest on the garden outside, observing the growth of herbs and flowers, the meticulous arrangement of each plant, and the small evidence of care that mirrored the attention I intended to apply in understanding and responding to the family dynamics inside. The afternoon waned and shadows lengthened, the play of light across the walls marking the passage of time. I felt the quiet strength of knowing, the stability of measured thought, and the empowerment that comes from attention and mindfulness. I made a list in my journal, not of complaints or grievances, but of observations, of subtle shifts, of details that could inform careful choices in the near future. This deliberate note-taking became an exercise in clarity, a reminder that the situation could be approached strategically, rather than emotionally. The calm rhythm of the house, the sound of a distant lawn mower, the occasional bird landing on the feeder outside, all reinforced the contrast between the external continuity of life and the internal examination I was conducting. I moved back to the living room and adjusted the cushions, straightened a photograph frame, small gestures that symbolized control and attentiveness. I sat again, observing Daniel as he moved through the room with Victoria, noting the ease with which they interacted, the subtle cues that communicated their expectations and assumptions, and the small fissures that hinted at uncertainty or conflict. In this quiet observation, I felt a growing sense of preparedness, an understanding that careful awareness, patience, and deliberate consideration would provide the clarity needed to respond thoughtfully to each unfolding moment. The late afternoon light softened, warming the room, and I took a final sip of coffee before setting the cup down, letting the warmth settle through my body. I felt the quiet assurance of being present, of seeing clearly, of having the mental space to recognize patterns, intentions, and the subtle dynamics at play. The day had begun with a confrontation, but it would continue with measured attention, the careful observation of behaviors, and the quiet accumulation of insight that would guide the choices and actions in the days to come. The evening settled over the neighborhood, the sky turning a soft orange as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn and garden. I walked slowly along the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick rug beneath my feet, and paused briefly at each doorway, observing the spaces that had once been filled with family life, now quiet and awaiting the unfolding evening. I reached the study and ran my fingers over the spines of books I had collected over decades, each title a marker of knowledge, patience, and reflection, grounding me in a world that remained steadfast even as the currents of my family shifted unpredictably. The sound of the kitchen faucet turning on and off echoed faintly from the other side of the house, a mundane rhythm that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension that had permeated the morning. I took a seat at the small writing desk near the window, opened my journal, and began to list the interactions I had observed earlier, the subtle inflections, the glances, the unspoken cues that spoke volumes about intentions, priorities, and alliances. Each note became a mental map, a way to chart the dynamics quietly playing out under the surface of everyday routines. I allowed my thoughts to drift briefly to past family gatherings, recalling laughter, shared stories, and moments of warmth that now carried a bittersweet edge, reminders of what had been and the contrast to the strategic vigilance required in the present. The light from the window softened as dusk approached, filtering through the curtains and highlighting the small imperfections in the walls, the faint marks left by years of moving furniture and adjusting frames, details that I now examined with renewed attention, each an anchor in a day that otherwise felt unsteady. I heard the muffled voices of Daniel and Victoria in the living room, their conversation casual yet layered with the subtle tension that had defined the day, and I noted the pacing, the pauses, the emphasis on particular words that hinted at control and influence. I sipped from my cup of tea, the warmth steadying my resolve, and traced the patterns of their dialogue in my mind, understanding that every small gesture and choice of language contributed to a broader strategy one needed to comprehend. I moved to the window, watching as a neighbor watered their garden, the repetition of motion a calming backdrop to my internal analysis, the consistency of their actions a reminder of the patience and care required to navigate the complexities of my own household. I returned to the living room and straightened the cushions, aligned the picture frames, and adjusted small details that reinforced a sense of order, a visual and tactile assertion of presence in the spaces that were mine as much as theirs. The fading light created a gentle warmth, and I allowed myself a quiet breath, acknowledging the patience, attention, and deliberate observation that had become my tools in understanding the subtleties of family interactions. I reviewed my mental notes, connecting behaviors from earlier in the day to past incidents, noting patterns and consistencies, and considering the implications of each for future decisions. The sound of the clock ticking and the occasional bird settling on the feeder outside provided a gentle rhythm, a subtle reminder that time continued its steady march even as I worked to piece together the strategies, motives, and intentions quietly at play. I allowed a sense of calm to settle over me, a recognition that through observation, reflection, and careful consideration, I was equipping myself to act thoughtfully, with purpose and clarity, in a situation that demanded both patience and precision. The evening continued to deepen, the shadows lengthening, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of awareness, the steady accumulation of insight, and the readiness to engage with the dynamics of my family not with impulsive reaction but with informed, deliberate, and composed attention to every nuance that would guide the unfolding hours. The house had grown quiet with the approaching night, the soft glow of the lamps casting warm light across familiar furniture, each piece reflecting years of care and attention. I walked through the living room slowly, observing the subtle details that spoke to the routines of the household, the placement of books, the alignment of cushions, and the faint traces of earlier activity that hinted at the presence and movements of others. The aroma of the tea I had prepared lingered in the air, a comforting, familiar scent that contrasted with the tension that still hummed beneath the surface. I moved to the window, looking out over the garden where the last remnants of daylight played across the leaves, each shadow and highlight forming a landscape of calm that I absorbed with deliberate attention. My thoughts returned to Daniel and Victoria, their interactions now more apparent to me after hours of quiet observation, the subtle exchanges, the micro-expressions, and the unspoken signals that revealed more than words ever could. I noted how Victoria carried herself, the precision of her gestures, the calculated timing of her comments, and the way Daniel responded with a mix of reluctance and habit, each moment layered with implications that could only be discerned by patient, careful watching. I returned to the desk where my journal lay open, pen poised, and began to record observations, not in anger or judgment but as careful documentation, a structured mapping of the behaviors and choices that defined the current state of the household. Each entry became a point of clarity, a reference to revisit as I considered my next steps and contemplated the evolving dynamics of the family. The clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time, each second a reminder of the continuity of life, and the necessity of measured, deliberate thought in response to change. I observed the light shifting, the warmth softening as night drew closer, and allowed myself a moment to reflect on the patterns I had seen over the course of the day, connecting them to previous interactions and identifying consistencies that revealed intentions, priorities, and unspoken rules. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floor under my feet provided a rhythm to the evening, a gentle framework within which I could structure my awareness and maintain my presence in the space without intrusion or disturbance. I considered the history of the home, the accumulation of memories and routines that had created a foundation for stability, and how that stability could be leveraged in understanding and responding to the behaviors of others. Each object, each familiar texture and sound became a point of reference, a reminder of the constancy I could rely upon even as interpersonal dynamics shifted. I sipped my tea, allowing the warmth to center me, to focus my attention, and to reinforce the steady, deliberate mindset I was cultivating. The moments of observation and reflection were themselves acts of agency, a demonstration of control and awareness that required neither confrontation nor overt action, but which nevertheless positioned me to respond effectively when the circumstances demanded. The evening continued, the shadows lengthening, the light softening to a deep amber, and I continued my careful surveying, mentally noting interactions, gestures, and responses, weaving them into a coherent understanding of the unfolding situation. Each step I took, each note recorded, and each observation made contributed to a growing internal map of intentions and influences, preparing me to navigate the delicate balance between patience, presence, and strategic engagement. The house exuded calm, yet within that calm, I held the awareness of complexity, of subtle tensions, and of the nuanced interplay of personalities that had always defined family life. In this quiet vigilance I found a renewed sense of purpose, a readiness to engage with thoughtfulness, insight, and composure, aware that the unfolding evening was but a chapter in a larger story that required both observation and measured action. The night deepened and the house took on a different quality, the shadows softening in the dim light of the lamps while the silence carried an almost tangible weight. I moved carefully from room to room, taking note of the subtle shifts in the environment since the morning confrontation, observing where furniture had been moved, which lights were left on or off, and how the spaces themselves seemed to reflect the changes in human interaction within them. I paused in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic outside, grounding myself in the continuity of the world beyond my immediate concerns. The familiar comfort of routine guided my actions as I set out fresh coasters on the side tables, straightened a throw on the sofa, and adjusted picture frames so they hung evenly, each small motion a deliberate act of presence and order. I returned to the kitchen and brewed a second pot of tea, allowing the rich aroma to fill the room, a sensory anchor as I reflected on the observations I had made over the course of the day. Sitting by the window, I allowed the view of the garden to draw my focus, noting the interplay of light and shadow on the plants, the delicate sway of branches, and the quiet activity of birds settling in for the night, each detail a reminder of the patience and attention required to truly perceive patterns. My thoughts wandered to Daniel and Victoria, considering the subtle behaviors I had witnessed. The way Victoria arranged items on the table to signal dominance, the way Daniel sometimes hesitated before responding to her directives, and the way small gestures and expressions communicated more than words ever could. I began to catalog these mental notes, linking them to past incidents and behaviors, constructing a quiet but detailed map of the household dynamics, a strategy built on observation rather than confrontation. The evening light shifted, casting a golden hue across the room, and I took a moment to breathe deeply, allowing the calm to settle into my body while my mind remained alert and attentive. I reviewed the journal entries I had made earlier, adding subtle annotations, considering each as a clue to understanding motives, priorities, and possible patterns of influence within the family. I moved to the living room once more, adjusting cushions and straightening rugs, noting the minutiae of daily life, and how these small elements could be used to interpret behavior and interaction. The rhythmic ticking of the clock, the gentle creak of the floor as I moved, and the faint rustle of leaves outside all contributed to a sense of temporal awareness, a framework for observation that allowed me to see the passage of time alongside the progression of relationships and choices. I reflected on the importance of patience, understanding that the accumulation of small insights and careful attention would provide clarity and control far more effectively than any immediate reaction could. Each movement I made, each observation recorded in my mind, reinforced a growing sense of agency, the quiet knowledge that I could navigate the unfolding dynamics with deliberate, thoughtful action. As night fully settled, the lamps cast soft, steady pools of light, illuminating the familiar contours of the furniture and walls, reinforcing a sense of stability within the home. I allowed myself to appreciate the contrast between the external calm and the internal vigilance, recognizing that my presence, awareness, and careful consideration formed the foundation for responding to the subtle currents of influence and control that had begun to take shape. The evening stretched on, quiet and steady, and I remained attentive, documenting, observing, and processing, knowing that the insights gathered in this measured, reflective state would guide my interactions and choices in the days to follow, creating a strategy rooted in clarity, patience, and the quiet assertion of understanding. The night deepened further, and the household settled into a rhythm of quiet activity, the faint ticking of the wall clock providing a steady cadence as I moved deliberately through the rooms. I walked past the living room, noting the soft gleam of the polished hardwood floors, the subtle reflection of lamplight on the framed photographs, and the careful arrangement of personal items that spoke to years of habitual care. I paused at the bookshelf, letting my fingers glide over the spines of books, each title a small anchor to memory and continuity, grounding me amidst the subtle tension that had woven itself into the fabric of the day. I took a slow, measured breath and moved to the study desk, where I revisited my journal, reading over the observations I had meticulously recorded throughout the day, reflecting on the nuances of interaction between Daniel and Victoria, the small cues of intention, hesitation, and control. The gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of curtains in the evening breeze punctuated my reflections, providing a sense of constancy against the shifting dynamics I was observing. I poured myself a cup of herbal tea, the steam rising in delicate curls, and carried it to the window seat, where the garden stretched out beneath the soft glow of streetlights. I watched the subtle movements of the plants, the quiet presence of birds settling in the hedges, and the distant flicker of car headlights passing by, each detail reinforcing a sense of awareness and calm focus that contrasted with the subtle stress that had accompanied the earlier confrontation. My mind traced the interactions of the afternoon, the choice Daniel had made, the insistence of Victoria, and the patterns that emerged from their subtle exchanges, cataloging micro-expressions, tonal shifts, and gestures that revealed more than words ever could. I noted how Daniel's responses, though outwardly compliant, sometimes faltered in small, nearly imperceptible ways, while Victoria's careful orchestration of the environment and interaction spoke to a calculated confidence that required attention to fully discern. I allowed my awareness to extend to the physical space around me, noting how items were arranged, how small adjustments reflected the habits and priorities of those inhabiting the space, each observation adding layers of understanding to the ongoing narrative unfolding within the walls of my home. I returned to the living room and methodically arranged cushions, aligned the edges of rugs, and straightened picture frames, each act of order serving as a quiet affirmation of my presence, a subtle declaration of mindfulness and engagement without confrontation. I reflected on past gatherings, the laughter and warmth that had once defined family interactions, contrasting them with the precise, measured, and often tense exchanges that now define the household atmosphere. Each recollection informed my strategy, highlighting the importance of observation, patience, and deliberate response as tools for navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. The soft amber glow of the lamps deepened, shadows lengthened across the floors and walls, and I felt the accumulation of clarity and composure that had grown over the course of the evening. I sipped my tea slowly, allowing the warmth to reinforce my sense of centeredness, each taste grounding me in the present while my mind traced patterns and behaviors, cataloging them for future reference. The house remained calm externally, yet within, a quiet awareness persisted, an attentiveness to gestures, words, and timing that would guide the subtle, deliberate actions I intended to take. I allowed the night to envelop the space, the external quiet contrasting with the internal vigilance. As I reflected on the insights gained, the patience exercised, and the readiness to act thoughtfully when the moment required, cultivating a balance of presence, understanding, and strategic observation that would guide the household dynamics in the hours and days ahead. The night had settled fully over the neighborhood, the quiet of the house punctuated only by the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the floor under its own weight. I moved through the spaces with measured care, observing the small details that conveyed the rhythm of life and the subtle tension that lingered in the air. Each object, each piece of furniture, carried a history, a familiarity that provided grounding as I considered the interactions of the day. I returned to the living room and arranged the cushions, straightened the throw blankets, and adjusted the placement of photographs on the walls, the deliberate motions reinforcing a sense of presence and awareness. I poured myself a final cup of tea for the evening, allowing the warmth to seep through me, centering my thoughts and preparing me for the contemplative reflection that followed. Sitting by the window, I looked out over the garden illuminated by the soft glow of distant streetlights, noting the subtle movements of the plants in the night breeze and the quiet settling of birds as they found places to roost. My mind traced the sequence of interactions between Daniel and Victoria, reviewing the nuances, the pauses, the shifts in tone, and the micro-expressions that revealed intentions, priorities, and subtle alliances. I made mental notes of each observation, understanding that patience and careful attention provided clarity and insight that immediate reaction never could. The house felt stable, yet the awareness of the complexities within it required constant vigilance, a quiet attentiveness that allowed me to anticipate behaviors and consider responses with care. I reflected on past family gatherings, recalling the warmth, laughter, and routine of shared meals, contrasting them with the tension and calculated exchanges of the present, each memory reinforcing the importance of measured observation and strategic thought. I moved to the study desk, revisiting my journal, reviewing and adding entries that detailed interactions, gestures, and patterns, constructing a mental map of the household dynamics that could guide my understanding and decisions in the coming days. The gentle tick of the wall clock, the distant murmur of cars on the street, and the soft rustle of leaves outside created a backdrop of continuity, reminding me that life outside the house proceeded in steady rhythms, even as internal dynamics required careful navigation. I allowed my attention to extend to the smallest details, noting how items were placed, the subtle adjustments in lighting, and the positions of everyday objects that reflected both habit and intention. Each observation became part of a larger comprehension, a layered understanding of influence, control, and the quiet assertions of presence that shaped the household environment. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth focus my thoughts, and allowed a sense of quiet determination to take root, the knowledge that understanding, patience, and careful attention were the tools I would employ to navigate the complexities of family interactions. The lamps cast soft light across the rooms, highlighting familiar textures and shapes, reinforcing a sense of stability while my mind remained alert to subtle shifts. I reflected on the accumulation of insight gained through hours of observation, realizing that these deliberate, measured actions and perceptions provided a foundation for thoughtful response, ensuring that any engagement would be informed, precise, and deliberate. The night deepened further and I felt a quiet confidence settling within, the awareness that by watching, noting, and reflecting, I had positioned myself to navigate the unfolding dynamics of the family with clarity, patience, and composure, ready to respond in ways that were deliberate, thoughtful, and grounded in careful understanding of the environment and the people within it. The first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, casting soft, muted tones across the living room where I had spent the night in quiet reflection. I moved slowly to the window and looked out over the garden, noting the dew on the grass and the way the early sun touched the tips of the shrubs, illuminating them with a gentle warmth. The house remained still, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of cars and the occasional chirping of birds beginning their morning routines. I carried a cup of tea to the small table by the window, the porcelain smooth and comforting in my hands, and took a slow sip, allowing the warmth to focus my mind and settle my thoughts. The events of the past day and night played back in my mind in meticulous detail. The confrontation, the subtle cues I had observed, the patterns of interaction between Daniel and Victoria, and the ways in which their behaviors had revealed priorities and intentions without a single word being spoken aloud. I allowed myself to reflect on the broader context, thinking about the past months and years, the accumulation of moments that had shaped the current state of the household, and the quiet strength required to navigate these complexities with awareness and composure. I walked through the kitchen, noting the placement of dishes, the subtle signs of the previous evening's activity, and the small details that spoke to the routines and habits of the family. Each observation reinforced my understanding that clarity came from careful attention, from seeing beyond the surface of interactions and noting the small, often overlooked behaviors that conveyed meaning. I returned to the living room and adjusted a few cushions, straightened a throw and smoothed the surface of the coffee table, small gestures that asserted presence and attention without drawing notice, creating a sense of order in both the physical space and in my own mind. The sun rose higher, illuminating the room more fully, and I reflected on the dynamics I had witnessed. Daniel's hesitations, Victoria's subtle insistences, and the interplay of choice and influence that had defined the previous day. I made mental notes of each interaction, considering the implications for the immediate and longer-term future, the ways in which observation, patience, and deliberate awareness could guide thoughtful responses. I walked to the desk and revisited my journal, reviewing entries, connecting patterns, and noting consistencies that revealed both intention and impact. The act of recording observations was itself a form of preparation, a way to reinforce clarity and ensure that understanding would inform future decisions. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the stability of the space around me, the consistency of routine, and the grounding influence of the familiar environment as I considered how to engage with the family dynamic in a way that was composed, precise, and deliberate. I observed the subtle movements of Daniel and Victoria as they moved through the house, their interactions both ordinary and revealing, each gesture, glance, and pause adding to the mental map I had been constructing over the hours. The gentle warmth of the morning, the quiet presence of the garden outside, and the rhythm of daily life provided a calm counterpoint to the mental clarity I was cultivating, allowing me to prepare for the moments that would require active engagement. I reflected on the accumulation of insight and understanding that had emerged from patient observation, the recognition that power and agency were not measured in immediate reactions but in the careful, deliberate attention to detail, the quiet comprehension of human behavior, and the thoughtful application of awareness. As the morning light grew stronger and the household began to stir with the day ahead, I felt the sense of readiness that comes from clarity and reflection, the assurance that my actions would be guided by careful thought, deliberate consideration, and a measured understanding of the subtle dynamics that had come to define the interactions within my family.